Now, I have a confession to make. I don't really enjoy watching horror movies. But in the spirit of Halloween, I told myself I'd watch at least one horror movie, and then proceeded to put it off for the entire month. But when I finally decided to sit down and put on something spooky, I decided to go with The Ring, as I hear many people consider this to be one of the scariest movies of all time. So as someone who doesn't typically enjoy horror, what did I think of this movie, and do I think it lives up to its reputation? Let's find out in my review for The Ring. The Ring follows a journalist named Rachel as she investigates the mysterious circumstances surrounding the deaths of a group of teenagers. Yet the only lead she has to go off of is an urban legend about a cursed VHS tape that kills whoever watches it in 7 days. With nothing else to go off of, she sets out to uncover the truth behind this legend and determine whether or not the tape can actually kill someone by watching it herself. Going into The Ring, I had a general idea of how the curse worked, and also knew how people met their end once their 7 days were up. And I feel like knowing these things really takes away from the impact of watching The Ring, as if you likely know anything about The Ring, it's that one scene that pretty much everyone already knows about. And that's pretty much the biggest scare that this movie has to offer. And while I'm sure it would have been terrifying to see when this movie first released, that scene has become such a huge part of pop culture and horror in general that it's not really as impactful watching it after knowing it's coming. And it definitely left me feeling like, oh, that's it? Like, there's nothing more to it when I finally got to that part. And so I think that one part of the movie becoming such a huge part of pop culture has really taken away from this movie's effect if you are watching it for the first time, as you will likely already know what's about to happen. As a result, I was relatively underwhelmed by the horror aspects of this movie, and found it to be relatively tame, at least compared to some other horror movies. However, that's not to say that I think The Ring is a bad film. I just think it makes for a much better mystery thriller than it does a horror movie. I especially liked how the suspense built up throughout the movie, as it counts down the days the characters have left until they hit their 7th day, and have to face the consequences of watching this video. And to me at least, the best parts of this movie were definitely the investigation behind this tape and discovering the truth behind its origin. And I feel like that 7-day countdown is great for people who may not really like horror movies, as it sort of tells you that nothing bad is really going to happen until that 7th day, and everything leading up to that won't really be too scary, so you won't really be expecting any monsters to be jumping out from around corners and jump scaring you, or ghosts to be haunting these characters throughout. And so the audience doesn't really have to worry about the characters being under the threat of death until that final day, which helps this film to focus more on the mystery aspect rather than constantly trying to scare you. Though that's not to say there aren't any jump scares in this movie, as there are quite a few, though I found their use to be rather effective, except for maybe like one or two that seemed unnecessary. But this isn't a film that's just going to be filled with cheap jump scares and nothing else. I also appreciated that this isn't an overly violent film either, as we are never really shown how the characters actually die. Instead, we just see the aftermath of their bodies. And while some of the bodies can be quite grotesque, I would argue that it's not as gruesome or violent as something like Indiana Jones, which I feel like the deaths in this movie are far more disturbing than what anything The Ring has to offer. Though I wouldn't really consider that a negative for The Ring, I'm just saying that, as far as violence goes, expect more in Indiana Jones, as I respected how The Ring avoids showing a lot of the violence and leaves the deaths up to your imagination. Now, as far as the visual effects go, I find that they still hold up, even after 20 years. There's nothing that stands out as obviously early 2000s CGI here, and it all looks very convincing still, with that one iconic scene from this movie still holding up to this day. However, there were a couple things that I did take issue with in this movie, the biggest of which being that it doesn't really explain the power used to create this tape. Now, it does a great job of explaining why the tape was made, but I feel like the how was a little too vague for me. I do wish that they had gone more in-depth into the character responsible for creating the tape, and that's something that you aren't going to find out in this movie, though I do think it's expanded upon in one of the sequels. And then the other thing I had an issue with was the ending of the movie, as it felt more like the characters had accidentally stumbled upon the solution rather than having to actually earn it. Overall, I would definitely say that The Ring is one of the best horror movies, though I wouldn't consider it the scariest by any means. Unfortunately, the fact that this movie contains one of the most iconic scenes in horror history really diminishes from the impact that scene has when you actually see it in the film, as you will likely have seen it referenced, or at least know what's going to come, long before you get to that point in the movie. And I feel like if you are aware of it, then it really just leaves you disappointed with how it's executed in the film, despite it being relatively impressive for its time. So if you are going to watch The Ring, I would definitely try to go in as blind as possible, so that you don't know what the ending has in store for you. I also think that The Ring makes for a great entry-level horror movie, as it saves a lot of the horror elements to the very end, and is more of a mystery thriller for the first two-thirds. And as far as horror goes, it really isn't that scary in the last third, at least not compared to some more modern horror movies. So while I may have been rather underwhelmed with the horror elements of this film, I feel like it's no fault of the film itself, but is more a byproduct of how iconic this film has become, and how referenced that one scene is by both parodies and in horror in general, that by the time you finally see it in The Ring itself, it really loses a lot of its initial value if you already know what's coming. But luckily, this film still manages to stand out with an engaging mystery that will keep you hooked throughout, even if the payoff doesn't answer all of the questions you may have about it. But these have just been my thoughts on The Ring. I guess all that's left to do now is watch the original Japanese version. But I think that can wait until next year. Did you watch anything spooky for Halloween this year? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, thanks for watching.